Alright, so we're going into the return era, and this is the return from the exile, and this is the final era of the Old Testament. We've gone through the beginnings, the patriarchs, the Exodus, the conquest, the judges, the united monarchy. We persisted through the divided monarchy, through the exile, and now we have the return to Jerusalem and Judah. And this era is going to be found in Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther, but we won't cover Esther tonight. And it is also found in Haggai and Zechariah. So those last three minor prophets are return era prophets. I didn't update that. But anyway, so the return from Babylon takes place in three waves. So there are 4 waves of exile and 3 waves of return. But they were spread out over a much longer period of time. And this is not easy to pick up from the Old Testament because Ezra and Nehemiah don't connect into the chronology quite as easily as all the rest of it did. So the first one is in 536, 70 years after Daniel was exiled in fulfillment of the 70 years prophesied by Jeremiah. The second one is 2 generations later with Ezra. And the third one is when Nehemiah comes back to rebuild the walls, and that's just 13 years after Ezra. So they were contemporaries and interacted with each other. So let's look at the first return first here. And this was in response to a decree by Cyrus the Great. He decreed that Jews who wanted to return and rebuild the temple could do so. And this ended up getting led by Zerubbabel, who was the son of Shealtiel, the son of Jehoiakim, who was the king of Judah, exiled by Nebuchadnezzar, who was released from prison by evil Marduk. And he died just shortly after he was released, but his grandson became the leader of the Jews who returned to Jerusalem. And they got there in time to celebrate the Feast of Tabernacles, and the first thing they did was rebuild the altar in the temple area.
Do you need to have like special stones for that? Or?
Yeah, you need special stones that have not been cut by a tool and such. So once they get the altar done, then they shift into rebuilding the rest of the temple itself. The altar is out in front of the temple in the temple courts, and the inside the temple had the holy place and the most holy place. And so in 535, they began laying the foundation to this second temple. Solomon's being the first, and this one being the second. Ezekiel's being the third temple, which has not been rebuilt or been built, and will be discernible from outer space when it does get built. Anyway, the Samaritans are people that start coming into the biblical narrative at this point in time. And they were people that were resettled in Samaria by Esarhaddon. And the unique origin story for them is Esarhaddon, of course, is one of the older Assyrian Empire emperors. He was the son of Sennacherib, who tried to conquer Jerusalem. But he was trying to pacify another people that he conquered in the empire, moved them into Samaria because that was an empty land, and so they started living there. The land had been taken over by wild animals though, and so a bunch of people started dying, and they're like, we don't know how to worship the God of this land, send us somebody who can teach us how to worship the God of this land. And so Esarhaddon finds amongst the exiles of the Samaritans, or some of the people from the northern kingdom of Israel, who had been deported about 50 years earlier, a priest, and that would have been one of the calf god priests that had come from Dan or Bethel, probably Bethel, because Dan was already taken over. But anyhow, so that priest comes back and teaches the Samaritans how to worship God, but not in the proper way, because they weren't worshiping down in Jerusalem or fulfilling all the laws of Moses in that way. They were worshiping in Samaria, and they were worshiping in the calf god ways. So the sins of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, persisted even after the people were exiled. And these people, so they're like starting to become Jewish in culture, but they are not Jewish by birthright. They are just random people from the rest of the empire resettled there to farm and pay tribute.
They're Gentiles.
Hmm?
They're Gentiles.
Yeah, they're Gentiles actually. So, anyhow, they start opposing the reconstruction of the temple because they see it as a rival to their temple and their worship. And so, at this time, the king of Persia, this guy by the name of Smerdis, and he was a usurper of the throne. He was pretending to be Cambyses, or the son of Cambyses, who was the son of Cyrus the Great. And so he orders the construction to halt while he is on the throne for just a brief little while. Anyhow, it doesn't take long. Smerdis gets taken off the throne because they realize he's not who he says he is. And a new king comes to the Persian throne, Darius, was been that one. And at this time, the prophets Haggai and Zechariah, who had come back with the first return, begin prophesying, and they encourage them to rebuild it or to restart construction. Now, at this time, they're not a sovereign nation, and so they're under Tatnai, who is the governor of the Transjordan, or that region of the empire. And he makes an inquiry as to what are you guys doing and what are you up to? And they say, we're rebuilding the temple in accordance with the command of Cyrus the Great, and Tatnai is an administrator of a sort, so that instead of saying stop until I find out further instructions, he lets them proceed with the rebuilding and launches an inquiry in the empire. And so the word gets to Darius. Darius makes a search for the decree of Cyrus. They have to go hunt it down, which is not like a Google search today. And so this would have been a massive imperial undertaking, going through all the archives, and they find it up in Ecbatana, which is the winter capital of the Persian Empire. So they had multiple places where the decrees had been stored, and they find it up there. And when they read the decree, though, they discover that the Persian Empire was supposed to underwrite the construction cost and make sure that the Persian Empire was paying for all the daily sacrifices that were necessary. It was one of the policies of Cyrus the Great that the Persians generally continued was make sure all the locals are worshiping their gods the right way so that their local gods do not conspire against the Persian emperor, and got to keep everybody happy. And so it's an interesting approach that they took to ruling, and it's worked out very much in their favor. So not all of a sudden, not only can they continue rebuilding the temple, but the Persian Empire is paying for it, and they don't even have to pay for it themselves. So the Samaritan opposition really backfired on the Samaritans because they did not end up stopping for long the reconstruction of the temple. And then when it got restarted, the local Jews who had returned didn't have to make all the payments. They were able to pass off the construction fees to the Persian Empire. So the Gentiles rebuilt the temple and paid for it. It was nice of them, especially since they were the heirs of the Babylonians who destroyed the first one. So, just take over responsibility for the reconstruction. So then 2 generations goes by, and you have a second return, which is led by Ezra. And this is while Artaxerxes rules Persia. So you have Darius the first, and then you have Xerxes the first, and Ezra was around in the time of Artaxerxes the first. And he records his return as being a 4-month journey. They bring a lot of gold and silver back from Persia. And when they arrive in Judah, they discover that the Jews who had returned had begun intermarrying with all the surrounding peoples. And this was something that they frowned upon quite significantly. And it's one of those things that needs to be interpreted properly, because today its passage is used to just encourage people from interracial marriages in a way that's not really biblically sound to interpretation. What was happening with the Jews is they would give their daughters to foreign sons, and they would take foreign wives as for their sons' wives. But then what ends up happening is that all the cultural ways and all the religious ways of the foreigners around them start getting absorbed into Israel, And so intermarrying was more than just a genetic issue, it was much more a religious issue. Now you're not just serving God in Jerusalem, you're also serving the Baals of the other nations and the calf god worship of the Samaritans and whoever the Philistines are worshiping and so forth. So it was much more of a religious faithfulness thing than it was intermarriage. Especially when you take into account of it that Ruth from Moab came and lived in Bethlehem and becomes the great-grandmother of David. Like there was intermarriage earlier. It's just with Ruth, she told Naomi, your God will become my God. Whereas in this generation, our gods will become your gods. And that was the problem that they were running into.
That's what led Solomon astray.
Yes, that's what led Solomon astray, is their gods became his gods. And so, anyhow, they confess their sin, they put away their foreign wives, and you have this mass national divorce go on, actually, which would have been very challenging, I can imagine, but it allowed them to maintain their pure worship and maintain the ways of Moses. So then we have the third return. That takes place after the book of Ezra is largely finished. And this is the book of Nehemiah. So at this point, they've got the temple rebuilt, but the city of Jerusalem is still in ruins. There's only a few people that live in it because most people live in the countryside, and it's not safe to live in the city because if you do business there, raiders may come in and steal everything you got. And so you end up becoming a target. So Nehemiah returns with the express intention of rebuilding the wall of Jerusalem, and this begins in 454. And they rebuilt the whole wall in a mere 52 days, which was miraculous and supernatural in some ways because you had a whole city's worth of people stop everything they're doing and start removing the rubble and rebuilding with all the gates and bars. So to have the material come together was something else. This, of course, was opposed by the Samaritans and all the surrounding peoples because they were afraid that the Jews were going to get the upper hand locally. And so Nehemiah and his workmen ended up having to rebuild the wall with a sword in one hand and their work tools in another hand all day long. And whenever they were attacked, Nehemiah would blow a horn and they would all rush to the point of attack, following the sound of the horn. Because they could be attacked from 360 degrees and they didn't have a wall protecting them anywhere until they had it rebuilt. Now this is the major story of what happens in the book of Nehemiah. Towards the end, we see Ezra pop up in the book of Nehemiah, and he reads the law of Moses to the people after they have dedicated the wall. And this is one of those national revival moments because all of a sudden everybody realizes, oh, that's what we're supposed to be doing and that's what we're neglecting to do. And it's one of those things where today, because everybody's got a Bible or 20 on their shelf and we have such amazing access to God's Word, in that day you had to have somebody read it to you, and there were only a few copies of it around, and it probably wasn't in your village or on your farm where you were living. And so you needed somebody to tell it to you or read it to you. And they did this in a national way, and all of a sudden the people were inspired to celebrate the Feast of Tabernacles because that was the time of year it was, and so they celebrated the Feast of Tabernacles in a massive way, and it was a national revival in a ways. So we skipped over the prophets. We'll come back to them here. Haggai, one of the shorter books of the Old Testament. It is a more fun prophet to read because it combines prophecy and storyline. Because you see how he's encouraging and motivating the people to rebuild the temple in his day, and that is the thing that is going on. So that's one of the major themes. But it's only 2 chapters long, so it's a really quick, short read. He's prophesying in about 522, 520. A lot of people think that he was an older prophet, and that Zechariah was a younger one, but they were contemporaries. They were prophesying at the same time. So, major theme that I mentioned is rebuild the temple, and that is a command that comes across in the book of Haggai, and he's actually mentioned in Ezra, so there's cross references between those two books.
Implying he's older. Implying that he's older.
Yeah, the book of Ezra was written by Ezra, but Ezra recorded the first return and wrote it down 60, 70 years after it actually took place. And so he compiles two different chunks of the history with a giant gap in between them. It's found between either Ezra 5 and 6 or between Ezra 6 and 7. But when Ezra comes on the scene, there's been a 60-year lapse in time. But Haggai gives a messianic encouragement to the rebuilders. Partly this is because everybody who was in Jerusalem that had seen Solomon's temple before it burned down realized that what they were starting to rebuild was not nearly as big as what had been. And so they were crying when they were celebrating that the temple was starting to get rebuilt. And Haggai encourages them by saying, "The latter glory of this house shall be greater than the former, says the Lord of hosts, and in this place I will give peace, declares the Lord of hosts." And that is because Jesus himself walked into that temple, and he gave peace to mankind through his death and resurrection, and it was in the era of that temple. Now, it had been substantially revised, rebuilt, and upgraded by Herod and the generation before Jesus, but it was still this original temple. It's considered the second temple. And then he ends the book by comparing Zerubbabel, who was the governor at the time, to a signet ring on the hand of God, which is like a symbol of power and authority. And so it's one of his ways of saying God is with you in what you are doing. Then we have the book of Zechariah, and this is another post-exile prophet, prophesied in the era of the first return, contemporary with Haggai, but he prophesied presumably a good deal longer. His book is a lot longer, and it's thought that he was a younger prophet when he spoke. And his book is very different from any of the other prophet or prophetic books. Maybe it would compare to Daniel some most. It records 8 visions that he has. And this is an interesting facet of the prophetic ministry of the Old Testament prophets, is that some of them were prophets that spoke the counsel of the Lord, and others of them were prophets that saw and had visions. And so they actually used to refer to prophets as a seer, and Samuel was referred to as a seer, and that is just simply one who sees. And they have visions and dreams and revelations from God in a visual fashion, and that's very much the way the first several chapters of Zechariah go. He has this vision, he has that vision, and there's an angel speaking to him, interpreting the visions and helping him to understand what he's seeing and what it means and what's significant about it. And some of them are things that have yet to be fulfilled, and some of them were specific to the days of rebuilding the temple and the characters that Zechariah was interacting with. There's mentions to Zerubbabel and also Joshua, who is the high priest at that time in that generation. But then the last parts of the book also has some messianic prophecies and apocalyptic prophecies too. In 11:13 it says, "The Lord said to me, throw it to the potter, the lordly price at which I was priced by them. So I took the 30 pieces of silver and threw them into the house of the Lord to the potter." What is that prophesying, Ariana?
Judas Iscariot.
Yep.
With the silver.
With the silver, and then they use the
And it
silver
says
to
buy the
buy the
potter's
potter's field. Yep. So that comes across 550 years before Jesus fulfills it, or Judas fulfills it in his generation. And that's one of those cool things, because that's very much an Old Testament prophecy, and we have extant copies of it from before Jesus was around, and then we see it fulfilled in Judas and Jesus' crucifixion. So
So that's like for sure, like, it had to have happened.
yep, the Old Testament prophecies of Jesus' first coming are so well attested and such that it is like beyond the shadow of a doubt that this is what was prophesied and this is Jesus' fulfillment of it. And so you can't conclude that they wrote the prophecies after the fulfillment to make it look like it. Virgil did that with the Romans. He wrote the Aeneid. Have you ever heard of that? So there's the Odyssey, there's the Iliad, and then the Roman version of those two is the Aeneid.
I know that one.
You've heard of it? I haven't read it, but I was hearing one of my friends talk about it. She's like, yeah, I was reading through it, and so Virgil's writing all this stuff into the ancient history of Rome so that the modern Romans who are reading it would be like, oh my gosh, we're the fulfillment of this prophetic word. This is amazing. But he was just making it up in their generation. It was really good propaganda. And it's not an uncommon thing in ancient history to find this type of thing taking place, actually. But with the Old Testament, the whole thing is attested to pre-Jesus, and then Jesus comes and fulfills it. And so the only alternative explanation is that the New Testament writers fabricated everything and then it didn't actually happen. But then it's really hard to explain the devotion that the 12 apostles had, and that they preached that message to their death and would not turn away from it.
All 12 of
Yep.
Nice job.
Minus,
Because
yeah,
he wasn't martyred.
them. Yeah.
yep.
But he was imprisoned.
Imprisoned in old age, presumably for stirring
Oh, yeah.
up something in Ephesus.
Who?
John.
He's stirring up
Yeah.
some.
Yeah, there's a few. Yeah, I'm not going there. Anyhow. So the apocalyptic prophecies of Zechariah are the fun ones that haven't taken place. One of them describes something that sounds like a neutron bomb going off, which is not a legal weapon of war, but illegal weapons of war tend to get built in catastrophic times. And so,
Wait, a neutron bomb?
yep, neutron bomb.
What is that?
It destroys all flesh but doesn't do anything with inorganic material. And there is a scene in Zechariah 14 or 13 that sounds described as looks like a neutron bomb going off. Could be something else, but
When was that invented?
it would be something since Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
Has it been created? Or
I
is
don't
it-
know if it's deployed or if it's theoretical. Anyhow, so this particular one, I will gather the nations against Jerusalem to battle, and the city shall be taken, and the houses plundered, and the women raped, and half the city shall go out into exile, but the rest of the people shall not be cut off from the city. Then the Lord will go out and fight against those nations as when he fights on a day of battle. And this is ironic for Zechariah to be preaching to the exiles who just returned to Jerusalem and are still trying to rebuild in the midst of all the devastation. And they have the ruins of the Babylonian destruction of the city. And then Zechariah is just prophesying about how it's going to happen again, by the way. And they didn't see it in their generation, obviously, but Daniel actually prophesies that desolations have been decreed, and implying that Jerusalem had a few more times of being desolated and depopulated. So, who knows how many more times that happens before the final time. Anyhow, then we're going to shift gears and get into the empires of Daniel, because we have missed a lot of the prophetic passages of Daniel. First, we're going to go to the vision that Nebuchadnezzar had. And this is always intriguing to me because God gives a vision to a pagan emperor who does not worship him, and does not serve him, and does not follow him, of all the things he is intending to do. And Daniel tells Nebuchadnezzar what dream he had, and then proceeds to interpret it. But this was the dream. He says, "You saw, O king, and behold, a great image. This image, mighty and of exceeding brightness, stood before you, and its appearance was frightening. The head of this image was of fine gold, its chest and arms of silver, its middle and thighs of bronze, its legs of iron, its feet partly of iron and partly of clay. And as you looked, a stone was cut out by no human hand, and it struck the image on its feet of iron and clay, and broke them in pieces. And then the iron, the clay, the bronze, the silver, and the gold all together were broken into pieces and became like the chaff of the summer threshing floors, and the wind carried them away, so that not a trace of them could be found. The stone that struck the image became a great mountain and filled the whole earth. There we go. So he reads it from the bottom to the top there. The iron, the clay, the bronze, the silver, and the gold. And then Daniel proceeds to interpret this dream for him, as interprets it to be 4 kingdoms, or empires, that were to come. The first one, the head of gold, being the Babylonian Empire that was in existence. And Nebuchadnezzar is probably the most powerful ruler of all time, in the sense that he had no limits on his authority. Whatever he said happened, and people did it. And this is a uniquely Oriental feature of rule. It was something that the Greeks and the Romans reacted against very strongly, and always wanted to have some check on absolute power. Even the Roman emperors, even though they seemed like they were all powerful compared to what we have today, they were working with laws, and laws restrained them from doing this, that, or the other thing. Nebuchadnezzar had no laws restraining him. In fact, that was not first introduced until the Persians came along, which actually were the next empire. And that is the silver part of this image. And the silver was the torso and the 2 arms. And the 2 arms refer to the Persians and the Medes, because it was going to be a 2-part army or empire. And the Medes and the Persians had just simply unified together to overcome the Babylonians. And I think Cyrus the Great was a Mede, but 2 kings later, when Darius the First took the throne, he united the rule under the Persians at the expense of the Medes. So then the next part is the bronze. So we're getting less wealthy, less ostentatious as we go down. And the bronze refers to the Macedonian empires, which starts with Alexander the Great and then becomes 4 separate kingdoms that were culturally united, but significantly different and always at war with each other. And then you have the legs of iron, which would refer to the Roman Empire. But then it gets mysterious, because the feet are baked clay and iron mixed together, and baked clay and iron don't mix together. That is a point of weakness. There'd be a lot of brittleness to it, and that is the point at which the stone hits the statue.
So who was that?
That's the point of speculation. A kingdom that has yet to arise and be fully identified, because it hasn't been destroyed yet. So when an empire gets destroyed by Jesus himself, who then reigns on earth and fills the earth with his kingdom, then we'll know which one the feet were. Until then, it's a point of speculation that's hard to confirm.
I mean, there have been other empires, but none of them were overthrown directly by Jesus.
Right.
So,
Yep. One of the things I'll point out about this is that there was a lot of suddenness to it. It says, let me see here. Going back. The stone was cut out by no human hand, which means it's of divine origin. And it struck the image on the feet and broke them into pieces. And Rome had the slowest death of any empire ever in the history of the world, actually. Because the empire was founded in, we'll say about 30 BC under Octavius or Augustus Caesar.
We'll take it back further, it's like
753, but it was a republic until
Yeah.
Octavius got the empire. So, the empire goes from like 30 BC in the west all the way to 476, but in the east, the same government is in power until 1453 AD. So it lasted almost 1,500 years, and it had the slowest death of any empire known in history, as far as I'm concerned. Because it could have died so many times, but it didn't. So this was not a sudden overthrow, like is described in this vision, being overtaken. So it seems like there's a part of this vision that is yet to be fulfilled. But Daniel continues with his prophetic and apocalyptic dreams. In Daniel chapter 7, Daniel himself has a vision. It says, I saw in my vision by night, and behold, the four winds of heaven were stirring up the great sea, and four great beasts came up out of the sea, different from one another. The first was like a lion and had eagle's wings. And then, as I looked, its wings were plucked off, and it was lifted up from the ground and made to stand on 2 feet like a man, and the mind of a man was given to it. And behold, another beast, a second one, like a bear, was raised up on one side. It had 3 ribs in its mouth between its teeth, and it was told, Arise, devour much flesh. After this, I looked, and behold, another like a leopard, with 4 wings of a bird on its back, and the beast had 4 heads, and dominion was given to it. And after I saw this, or saw in the night visions, and behold, a 4th beast, terrifying and dreadful, and exceedingly strong, and it had iron teeth. It devoured and broke in pieces and stamped what was left with its feet. It was different from all the beasts that were before it, and it had 10 horns. And I considered the horns, and behold, there came up among them another horn, a little one, before which 3 of the first horns were plucked up by the roots. And behold, in this horn were eyes like the eyes of a man, and a mouth speaking great things. So once again, we have 4 empires being represented here, and this is a significant passage because it allows us to interpret the book of Revelation a little more thoroughly, because he is depicting 4 empires in the form of a beast. First one is the lion. It has 2 wings. Which empire do you suppose that one would refer to, Ariana?
The one that had 2 arms.
Nope.
At least no.
Nope.
I don't know.
The first one, Babylon. They go in order again. So the lion is the Babylonian Empire, and has 2 wings because Nebuchadnezzar's army was able to move fast, and it zipped here and there, and it was given the mind of a man, because remember, at the end of Nebuchadnezzar's reign, he lost his mind for 7 years, and then it was restored to him. But he had been humbled in the midst of it, and his wings were clipped. And then the second beast is the bear, raised up on one side. It had 3 ribs in its mouth. And I've heard people identify the 3 kingdoms specifically that the Persians took out, but they just conquered the largest empire by land up to that point. It was much larger than the Babylonian Empire or the Assyrian Empire had been. So the bear represents the Persian Empire. And then this next one, leopard with 4 wings of a bird on its back, it had 4 heads. What's that one sound like?
Alexander the Great.
Yep, Alexander the Great. His army was faster than Nebuchadnezzar's army. He was one of the fastest armies of all time. He could move his army with immense speed, and his enemies thought he was flying. And so this is a very good prophetic illustration of him, because he had 4 wings in his kingdom. But the dominion of 4 heads is his empire getting split up into 4 kingdoms. And so it was a culturally unified empire that had 4 different heads. And so that's another fascinating thing, because the next beast has multiple horns and heads and such. And so we can see that you have a cultural empire that is unified culturally but has 4 different seats of power coming from it. Then we get to this last one. The 4th beast, terrifying and dreadful and exceedingly strong, iron teeth, devoured and broke in pieces and stamped what was left with its feet. It was different from all the beasts that were before it, and it had 10 horns. And this is where the mystery begins, because Rome partially fulfills this, but partially does not fulfill this. And so I suspect that the full fulfillment of this will be some resurrection of the Roman Empire in some fashion or another, but that's speculation. It's
How
hard.
was Rome fulfilled?
It was an empire of iron. It destroyed every single kingdom around it, and they did not have any significant kingdom next door to it that was either not a client state or actually conquered by them until the Parthians arose 500 years later. They just destroyed everything. Did we lose something on the recording? No? Okay. Anyway, so Daniel then goes and describes this 4th one a little bit further. It says, as for the 4th beast, there shall be a 4th kingdom on earth, which shall be different from all the kingdoms, and it shall devour the whole earth, and trample it down, and break it to pieces. And as for the 10 horns, out of this kingdom 10 kings shall arise, and another shall arise after them. He shall be different from the former ones, and shall put down 3 kings. He shall speak words against the Most High, and shall wear out the saints of the Most High, and shall think to change the times and the law, and they shall be given into his hand for a time, times, and half a time, or a year, 2 years, and half a year, which is an interesting way of rendering that, but it comes across a few other times in Daniel, so it's a point of connection between other passages. It says, but the court shall sit in judgment, and his dominion shall be taken away, to be consumed and destroyed to the end. And the kingdom and the dominion and the greatness of the kingdoms under the whole heaven shall be given to the people of the saints of the Most High. His kingdom shall be an everlasting kingdom, and all dominions shall serve and obey him. What does that sound like?
What? The words?
Yep, or this kingdom shall be given to the people of the saints of the Most High. His kingdom shall be an everlasting kingdom, not a temporary one. And all dominions shall serve and obey him.
What, like New Jerusalem?
Something. Jesus reigning on earth, apparently. So, I'm convinced that we'll only be able to positively identify this 4th beast in its fullest manifestation once it's been destroyed and Jesus' kingdom is established. In the moment, maybe, but so many things are easier to understand after the events have taken place, and then you can understand what was being prophesied. Like Judas Iscariot. In light of what we just saw, we now know what he was saying. Okay, I think that might have actually been the end. Nope. Ooh, I don't even have sheets for this. Alright, so I have to read from here. Let's see, so we've got another apocalyptic passage here. 77s are decreed for your people and for your holy city, to finish transgression and to put an end to sin, to atone for wickedness, and to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal up vision and prophecy, and to anoint the most holy place. Know and understand this: from the time the word goes out to restore and rebuild Jerusalem until the anointed one, the ruler, comes, there will be 7 sevens and 62 sevens. It will be rebuilt with streets and a trench, but in times of trouble. Now, this is an important passage because Daniel is prophesying this, and the beginning of this period is marked by Nehemiah rebuilding the walls of Jerusalem, which we covered in the return era just this evening. That was the decree issued to rebuild the city, was to rebuild the walls. And that started the 70 sevens, or the 70 weeks of Daniel, each week being represented by a 7-year period. And fascinatingly enough, that allows us to precisely predict when Jesus is going to come, and that is 30 AD, when he began his ministry. Being rebuilt in times of trouble refers to the Samaritan opposition that they faced, because they were always trying to come and defeat them while they were trying to rebuild the city. Let's see, after the 62 sevens, the anointed one will be put to death and will have nothing. That would be most likely. So there's a few different interpretations of this. Jesus being crucified, because he was the anointed one. That is what the Messiah means. It says, the people of the ruler who will come will destroy the city and the sanctuary, and the end will come like a flood. War will continue until the end, and desolations have been decreed. That's the verse I referenced earlier, about how there are many desolations of Jerusalem that have been decreed. Not very fun to hear when Jerusalem is desolate at the time, and everybody's going back to resettle it. Because you know it's not going to be permanent resettlement. It will be desolated again, and then again, and again another time.
But it has to be repopulated, to be redesolated.
Yep, it does. Interestingly enough, this prophecy was actually warped by the Jews in the year 133 AD. They wanted to revolt against the Romans in that year. This is known as the Bar Kokhba revolt. And so they tried to make the timeline point toward that year being the fulfillment of this. And so they erased 100 years of Persian Empire history from existence and just went from Darius the First to Darius the Third and skipped everybody in between. And because of that, then they were able to declare this guy Bar Kokhba as the Messiah and rally all the Jews in Jerusalem at the time around him into an army, and then the Romans came with their legions and destroyed Jerusalem. And it was desolated, and they burned down the temple, or the temple had already been burned down. They barred any Jews from living in the city. They actually were exiled out of the city, and they rebuilt the Temple Mount with a temple to Jupiter or Mars. I don't remember which one. So that seriously backfired on them. But this is an interesting prophecy that the Jews were aware of in those generations, and they realized we need to make this one line up for the guy that we want to be the Messiah, even though we're just cooking up a fabrication. But that's actually why the Jewish calendar has the year in the 5000s instead of in the 6000s, because they erased a few years of Persian history to make that one event look like it fulfills this prophecy.
So their calendar and timeline are still wrong?
Mm-hmm. Yep. Goes on, it says, he will confirm a covenant with many for 1 7, and in the middle of the 7 he will put an end to the sacrifice and offering, and at the temple he will set up an abomination that causes desolation until the end that is decreed is poured out on him. And I have heard this interpreted so many different ways, I'm really not inclined to even try to elaborate on it now that it's a 5 after 8 anyway. So we'll pause with that verse, and maybe we'll get back to it next week. But you can see some of the mysteries of Daniel.